Did you know American officers who had just marched as far as 85 miles on a handful of rice walked into a camp where the sick were laid in a row of cots called the zero ward beds for men expected to die? In April 1942, Lieutenant Colonel David L. Hardy's the Common Corps group reached Camp O'Donnell after 10 days on the road, 1 meal of raw rice, 13 of cooked, heat like a hammer on bare heads, and guards who treated a canteen as contraband. The first smell was latrine trench and fever. The first sound was coughing. The first rule was silence. Hardy later wired home in words as hard as bone. I am well. Am thin and weak from rice diet. I need money badly. He did not mention the flies shining blue on the living and the dead, or the men who swayed in line until a buddy's shoulder kept them upright. He did not mention the zero ward where a blanket could be a final promotion. He did not have to. Every American family would fill in the rest. The enemy tried to turn humiliation into a policy and terror into a schedule. They staged a show to prove escape was useless, forcing prisoners to repeat that guerrillas lived on roots and berries. They posted the blood brother rule, 10 men tied to one fate. If one escaped, 10 would die. When an escape elsewhere ended in recapture, guards lined 10 Americans before the whole camp and fired. Some had to be shot twice because the squad's aim was poor. The lesson was meant to be simple: obey or vanish. But the Americans learned a different lesson. Watch each other, pace each other, live as a unit. Why didn't order collapse? Because the same habits that moved a headquarters to safety under bombs now moved a prison barracks under starvation. On Christmas Eve 1941, Manila Bay burned like $1 billion Christmas tree, and Hardy helped shift the staff to Malinta Tunnel with inventory lists in hand. He watched General Douglas MacArthur keep his seat until seconds before the bombs hit, then walk to the shelter, the only man who ever drove Hardy to cover. That calm under fire became a template. In captivity, men made checklists for life. Rotate the sick into shade, boil water, even if it tastes like tin, count quinine tablets like ammunition, hide 1 spoon of sugar for a fever, keep a ledger even when there is nothing to record but names, work details turned into lifelines. Because GI ingenuity refuses a straight line to death. At Davao Penal Colony on Mindanao, Americans planted and harvested in rich soil, then watched guards drive carabao through the crops or let food rot as punishment. So the men stole back calories. They slipped cassava into woven baskets. They boiled fruit peels into bitter tea that felt like medicine and morale. Hardy, wrecked by a hernia and denied surgery, learned to weave better, to barter better, to last another day. Officers appointed by the Japanese to manage labor used that thin authority to build a community under the lash quiet rosters, fair shares, the invisible math of survival. The human element is a voice, steady and small. Be of good cheer, strong and courageous, Hardy wrote earlier to his wife. That is not bravado. That is a man telling a nation how to behave when no one is watching. He walked the line between fury and focus. He talked to the weak, the way leaders talk to rookies, short, simple, direct. He believed that honor is a daily drill, not a speech. The men believed it with him, and that belief looked like order even when order seemed impossible. Did the enemy realize what they were up against? They saw lines reform after beatings. They saw officers hold briefings with pebbles in the dust. They saw ledgers appear where nothing was allowed. They saw that a nation whose prisoners could keep a schedule under starvation could also keep a promise across an ocean. When the tide shifted, that habit scaled into fleets and raids. The country that treasured a hidden lump of sugar for a fevered friend would become the country that produced bombers like loaves of bread, ships like bricks, and rescue plans like clockwork. Death's prison tried to erase Americans by number. It taught them to live by name, and names are what a free nation comes back for. Did you know men marched up to 85 miles on little more than rice, some packed standing in boxcars from San Fernando to Capas, then forced to walk the last 5 miles to the wire at O'Donnell. Heat turned the road into a mirror. Tongues felt like wood. Filipino civilians stepped out with dippers of water and risked beatings or bullets for mercy. Hardy's group counted 10 days en route. 1 meal of raw rice, 13 of cooked, and still arrived with enough backbone left to form by unit. The guards wanted to see a mob. They saw a formation. That is a holy shit fact all by itself. Fear was scheduled like a shift. Placards hung on the necks of recaptured escapees. Fool. Caught. Starved. Prisoners were made to chant lines about roots and berries. The Blood Brother rule hammered the message home. Your mistake kills your friends. Major Charles F. Harrison Jr. was watched by his own 10 in shifts, not because they hated him, but because they loved him enough to drag him back from a fatal choice. The enemy thought that rule would fracture trust. It did the opposite. Americans made trust explicit. They built a duty roster for courage. Hardy's telegram home feels like a quartermaster speaking through a clenched jaw. I am well, am thin and weak from rice diet. I need money badly. That is how a responsible man asks for hope. Men shared ration scraps. They crushed vitamin tablets into rice and called it sauce. A corporal hid a square of chocolate, then split it 8 ways when fever hit the squad. Someone counted the ladles at the spigot and timed the guards' cigarette breaks. Data lived where nothing else could. The larger machine back home was learning the same lesson. Order is how. You beat chaos at scale. When Manila burned on the 24th of December 1941, the staff moved under sirens to Malinta Tunnel by checklist and courage. That was the same energy that, once unleashed, turned America into the arsenal of democracy. Assembly lines learned to breathe like soldiers. At a great plant in Michigan, a B-24 Liberator rolled off the line with the regularity of a clock. Shipyards threw up Liberty ships with a speed that looked like a dare. Statistics became a kind of music, the beat a free people can keep when the world goes dark. The human heart of the march is small, specific, and American. A private in worn boots guides a blind buddy by the elbow through a crowd at a water point. A captain whispers, "Hold the line," not as a slogan, but as a literal order to keep men alive until night falls. A Filipino teenager thrusts a coconut through a gap and disappears into the crowd before a rifle butt can find him. The march is cruelty measured in miles. The answer is kindness measured in inches. There is a moment when the enemy begins to understand. They see that every time a column halts, Americans reset spacing, fix straps, share sips, pass quiet orders. They see that discipline is not decoration. It is appetite with a harness on it. They see that a people who can march like this, starved and blistered, will not stay beaten. The long road to O'Donnell was meant to shatter a nation's will. It hardened it. Years later, when Rangers and Alamo Scouts stepped off toward Cabanatuan under a night sky, the rhythm of their feet matched the rhythm learned on that road. America had been keeping time all along. Did you know one escape could mean 10 Americans shot while the entire camp was forced to watch? Some men hit more than once because the firing squad missed. The rule was simple and satanic: tie 10 lives together and dare hope to move. The Japanese called it discipline. Americans answered with a deeper discipline, mutual vigilance, and stubborn planning. Guards thought they'd turned the camp into a trap. Prisoners turned it into a network. The game, once learned, ran under the surface like a second river. Every third day in this story, we ask a hard question before the answer. How do you stop escapes when men would rather die free? The enemy said, "Threaten the group." Americans said, "Strengthen the group." They posted lookouts inside the barracks. They tracked guard habits by hour. They taught the weak to wait for the strong. They made trust and time work together. When the question is survival, the answer is a schedule. The human element is a leader you can touch. Hardy spoke with the officer who had to stand before his 10 men now chained to his choices, and the man's hands shook for weeks. That officer did not sleep much after taps. He wrote letters that began, "Dear Mother," and ended with smudges where his name should be. Major Harrison walked like a man between weather fronts, fear on one side, duty on the other, and his friends watched him because they would not let him go alone into death. This is what American loyalty looks like up close. Quiet, stubborn, and counted in shifts. Terror lived in the daylight. Guards staged morale plays to paint escape as folly and guerrillas as ghosts. Recaptured men wore placards and shame. Prisoners were told the emperor owned everything but their breath. But even the enemy's theater taught the Americans something. If a show can be staged, so can a rescue. If a message can be forced, a message can be smuggled. If a rule can be posted, it can be mapped and timed. The same brain that fields a baseball team or runs a loading dock can outthink a system built on fear. Here is a truth that makes enemies blink. Americans suffer, count, and then act. The Blood Brother rule produced an unintended result: squads that lived like families and planned like units. Men learned to signal with nothing but posture and silence. A raised chin at evening muster might mean, wait. A knuckle on a cot frame might mean tonight. A cough might mean not yet. Someone drew a rough map in the dirt and erased it with a heel. Someone else learned which guard smoked after midnight and which guard dozed. The camp's cruelty created a classroom. Americans turned in homework the enemy could not read. The moment of enemy shock is not fireworks. It is the absence of sound at a roll call when one expected name answers from miles away. It is the discovery that a man who should be dead is not, and the 9 who should be mourning are focused, restful, dangerous. The realization spreads slowly. These people do not break the way we expected. They bend into each other and get stronger. They are not 10 men chained to a rule. They are 10 men tied to a purpose. And purpose, once learned, stands up when rifles do. The bridge to what comes next is simple and electric. In the worst place, Americans learned the best way to live together. That knowledge would jump the wire. It would cross rivers and airfields. It would ride on the backs of scouts and on the skids of rescue trucks. When rangers later moved at night toward a camp at Cabanatuan, they brought maps, radios, and courage. They also brought the secret learned under the Blood Brother rule. We go as one, and we come back as one. Did you know a US headquarters moved under bombs on Christmas Eve and never missed a checklist? Manila Bay burned so bright that night that a battle-hardened officer called it a billion-dollar Christmas tree. The city was a mirror of fire. Fuel tanks roared. Sirens moaned against the stone of Intramuros. Yet inside Malinta Tunnel on Corregidor, pencils scratched, orders went out, rosters were checked, and supplies were counted. Lieutenant Colonel David L. Hardy watched General Douglas MacArthur sit at his desk until the last safe second, then walk to the shelter with the calm of a courthouse judge. "The only man who ever drove me to cover," Hardy said, later, and that line tells you exactly how Americans handled shock. They did not panic. They organized. That night forged a habit that saved men in cages months later. If you can inventory under air raids, you can ration rice under guard towers. If you can move a staff across a burning harbor, you can shift a sick man to shade before the fever takes him. The tunnel taught a grammar of survival: short orders, clear tasks, no wasted motion. That same style shows up in Hardy's POW notes: who turns the pump, who boils water, who takes the night watch by the fence, who smuggles the letter out. It is the opposite of chaos. It is American. Be of good cheer, strong and courageous, Hardy had written to his wife early in the siege. That is not a slogan. That is a day plan. In the camps, men lived it. A corporal slipped a crushed vitamin tablet into a buddy's rice. A captain kept a ledger of quinine like it was ammunition. A chaplain passed 2 spoonfuls of sugar to a man shaking with chills and told him, "Hold the line." Even the way they spoke was tactical. short, firm, kindly. The kind of language that builds a bridge from one more hour to one more day. The enemy tried to break that bridge with theatre. Recaptured escapees wore placards. Fool. Caught. Hungry. They were driven past the barracks to prove that hope was a trick, then the blood brother rule. 10 men tied to one fate. If one ran, the 9 would fall. But that rule did something the guards did not expect. It tightened the American weave. Squads became families with a duty roster for courage. They watched each other like brothers. They shared tiny reserves with a precision that would shame a freight office. You could call it stubbornness. You could also call it faith. Here is the turn that makes the mind real. The same discipline that held inside a tunnel and behind barbed wire scaled into a nation of factories. The B-24 Liberator heavy bomber rolled from lines like bread from an oven. The P-51D Mustang learned the long-range escort game and made the skies safe highways. Shipyards threw up Liberty ships until the ocean looked like a conveyor belt. Numbers became a war song. One bomber after another, one hull after another, one crate of plasma after another. Production was not just metal, it was mercy in mass. And yet the heart of this chapter is still the man who writes home with a cool hand. I am well, am thin and weak from rice diet. I need money badly. He does not ask for tears. He asks for a transfer of hope. He knows that the same nation that counted pencils under bombs can count ships under searchlights and count miles under a rescue plan. He knows that order is how free people make miracles look normal. That is what the enemy missed. They thought fear was a system. Americans knew order was a power source. The bridge to the next revelation is bright as that burning bay. If a headquarters can move in the middle of fire and a prison squad can live by schedule in the middle of hunger, what happens when the whole country moves like that at once? What happens when checklists turn into convoys, when ledgers turn into fleets, when a hidden spoon of sugar turns into a policy called "Leave no man behind"? The answer is coming, and it will arrive the way a clock strikes. Right on time. Did you know the most powerful message from a prisoner of war can fit in one line? I am well, am thin and weak from rice diet. I need money badly. That is not drama. That is logistics from a man with no freedom but a full sense of duty. Lieutenant Colonel David L. Hardy knew which words mattered. He sent home the only ones that could move food, medicine, and faith. In Cabanatuan, the air smelled like heat and sickness. Flies droned. Men coughed until the ribs hurt. The Zero Ward waited like a verdict. Yet the camp did not become a graveyard of hope. It became a workshop. Watch the small American machines spin. Smuggled pesos tucked into a shoe heel to buy a scoop of beans from a friendly worker. A list of the weakest posted in a barracks corner so rations could tilt toward the edge cases. A schedule of boiling times so water did not steal fuel. A pecking code on bunk frames to pass notes. These are not stories of comfort. These are stories of competence. Be of good cheer, Hardy had told his wife earlier. In the camp, that line meant the squad would move you closer to the wall at noon. They would urge you to sip slowly. They would share the last taste of sugar like a sacrament. The enemy thought hunger would erase dignity. Instead, dignity became stubborn. A captain with a hernia learned to weave baskets that did not fall apart. A clerk with malaria kept a ledger so neat that a banker would smile. A sergeant timed a guard's smoke breaks and built a map of minutes no one else could see. Commanders, appointed by the Japanese Americans with the thinnest slice of authority, used it to keep fairness alive. They balanced work details. They protected the sick from the worst jobs. They bargained with interpreters who could be kind at breakfast and cruel by lunch. Humanity flickered in odd places. The system stayed brutal. The men stayed human anyway. Listen to the voices. Hold the line. Drink now. Save that for night. They sound like combat orders because they are. The battlefield just has bamboo and lice instead of hedgerows and tanks. A corporal whispered a Bible verse to a shivering friend and felt the tremor smooth out under his hand. A lieutenant traded a handmade basket for a handful of cassava and walked it across the yard as if carrying a live shell. A chaplain wrote down names every evening and spoke them aloud so they would not go missing twice. The camp heard those names and drew breath as if the roll call were air. Here is the part that should make anyone say, "Holy cow." Even in that place, Americans found ways to give. A guard sickened. A prisoner handed him water. Japanese lieutenant treated a beaten man decently one afternoon, and a dozen Americans shared extra scraps his way that week. Mercy was not weakness. It was a message. It said, "We remember the rules even when you do not." In a war where the enemy loaded unmarked hell ships and let prisoners bake in holds, that American choice turned into a kind of power. It made rescuers move faster. It made testimony ring louder later. The enemy noticed the rhythm. They saw lines form neatly for soup, even when bowls were broken. They saw men take turns at the spigot without a guard barking orders. They saw squads protect their most stubborn members, because that is what families do. A system built on fear had no answer for a habit built on fairness. You cannot whip a schedule. You cannot scare a ledger. You cannot outshout a man who has decided to share. This chapter ends with a hand on a shoulder and a plan on a scrap of paper. Names, times, a path to the latrine that also passes the wire. A rumour of rangers and scouts out there somewhere, training in silence, learning the feel of rice paddies under their boots at night. Thin and weak is not the same as finished. A line sent home, a ledger kept inside, a habit of care, these are the bones of a rescue. The next part of the story asks the hardest question yet. When humiliation and beatings fail, what finally slows escape attempts? And how do Americans turn even that answer into an advantage? Did you know the enemy tried humiliation, beatings, and staged morale plays? Then raised the stakes to mass execution, and still Americans kept planning. The placards said, "Fool." The lectures said, "Roots and berries." The blood brother rule said one man's dash would kill 9 friends. That should have ended every thought of escape. It did slow it, but it did not stop American thinking. Instead, prisoners studied the problem like engineers. If public shame did not work, the enemy threatened the group. So the group got stronger. Trust turned from a feeling into a schedule. Here is our question chapter. If humiliation and pain did not end escape attempts, what finally did? The answer was pure terror. Shoot 10 for 1. That changed tactics but not spirit. Americans turned from reckless runs to long games. They hid strength. They traded time for certainty. They mapped guard paths. They built signals so small they looked like fidgets. A touch to a cot frame meant later. A slow blink at evening muster meant wait. In a world of bayonets and bamboo, time itself became a tool. The human face of this lesson is Major Charles F. Harrison, Jr., watched by his own 10 like a brother at the edge of a cliff. They took turns sleeping near him. They spoke to him in plain words. Not yet. We need you. We go together. It was not pretty. It was not romantic. It was love in boots. Hardy spoke with an officer who had to stand before his 10 and feel their breaths depend on his. The man's hands shook for weeks. He kept walking anyway. That is a form of valor we do not pin to uniforms. We pin it to memory. Work details became classrooms. At Davao Penal Colony, prisoners raised crops and then watched guards wreck them out of spite. So Americans learned to hide calories in plain sight. A basket handle could hold a strip of dried cassava. A work song could hide a count. 2 Japanese lieutenants sometimes showed decent sense. And the men banked those moments like rainwater in a drought. A judo-trained sergeant major slammed men into the dirt, and the shock taught others to move before he reached them. You can learn from cruelty. You can also refuse to copy it. The enemy's shock arrived quiet. They looked out at a yard of thin men and saw order. They saw that squads still formed, that petty officers still whispered assignments, that chapel services still drew circles of bowed heads. They saw that Americans treated the rules of war as sacred, even when the rules were used against them. And then the consequence they never meant to create arrived. The very fear that slowed escapes built units so tight they could be led out all at once when the hour came. Rangers would not have to carry a mob. They would guide a formation. Beyond the wire, the nation was building the tools to match that spirit. Long-range fighters like the P-51D stretched steel umbrellas over convoys and bombers. Submarines hunted the sea lanes and squeezed the enemy's food. Engineers laid bomber strips on islands like a set of stepping stones. None of that metal would matter without the human design learned in the camps: move as one, share as one, decide as one. The rescue at Cabanatuan would prove it in a single night, with Alamo scouts ghosting ahead, with a P-61 Black Widow buzzing the field to steal eyes and ears, with carts and bare feet and raw courage pouring through the gap like water. This chapter closes on a simple scene. A man in a barracks watches the moon slide behind a palm. He hears a cough code from 2 bunks over. Not yet. He rolls to ease the ache in his ribs and touches the rough wood with 2 fingers. Still here. He thinks of a line sent home months before and of a tunnel lit by flashlights on a holiday night. He is thin. He is weak. He is still writing the next page in his head. The enemy believed fear could end the story. Americans turned fear into a pause between beats. The music starts again in the dark. Did you know there was a prison farm with orchards, rice paddies and fish ponds, where American prisoners raised food all day and still went to bed hungry? Davao Penal colony on Mindanao looked like Eden from the fence line. Tall coconut palms. Rows of cassava. Paddies shining like mirrors after rain. But the system turned abundance into punishment. Guards walked carabao through young shoots to wreck the harvest. Fruit rotted on the ground to teach men not to steal. So Americans built a different kind of farm, one planted in discipline and care. A basket handle hidden with dried cassava, a sling made from palm fiber to carry a secret sweet potato, a work song that timed the guard's smoke break to the second. This is how a free people sows hope under a boot. Names make it real. Lieutenant Colonel Richard G. Hunter and Lieutenant Colonel Russell J. Nelson were among the Americans appointed to manage labor details. They had almost no power. But they used what they had, like engineers. The sick were protected from the hardest rows. The strongest were rotated to keep them from collapsing. A chaplain saved a spoon of sugar for men with fevers and passed it like a blessing. A clerk with malaria kept a ledger so clean a stateside banker would smile. A captain ruined by a hernia learned to weave baskets tight enough to carry contraband beans without spilling a single one. In a place built to shatter order, order grew like a vine through cracks in the wall. Dub Cole taught a hard math. Calories in, calories out, minutes gained, minutes saved. If you were on the hospital line, you learned the sound of quinine in a tin cup and the way a buddy's hand could steady a shaking spoon. If you were on the field line, you learned to move when Sergeant Major Hashimoto's shadow slid your way, the judo throw arriving like a sudden wind. Some Japanese lieutenants showed flashes of decency, and the men banked those moments like water in a jar during dry season. It did not change the system. It changed the odds. That is what Americans do with a bad hand. They count. They share. They play anyway. Voices mattered. Drink now. Breathe. Hold the line. These were the orders of the day. They sounded like combat because they were. A private with cracked heels guided a half-blind friend by the elbow to the spigot and back. A lieutenant bartered a basket for a handful of beans and walked the prize across the yard with the slow care of a man carrying nitroglycerin. A Filipino labourer slipped a mango under a gate and disappeared into green light before a rifle butt could find him. Mercy jumped the fence. It always does. Here is the shock that made the enemy blink. Even in a camp with gardens, starvation could not erase American fairness. Lines formed without shouting. The sick got the small advantage. The strong carried the heavy yoke without complaint. The yard kept the rhythm of a stateside shop floor, because that is the rhythm of freedom. Task, handoff, check, next task. The machine at home would learn that beat too. It would hum in Michigan and California and New Jersey. It would shape aluminum and roll steel, and fill wooden crates with plasma and penicillin. It would turn the sky into an American highway and the sea into an American supply chain. The bridge to that larger machine is simple and bright. A prison farm taught a nation how to treat time as a weapon. A squad learned to share so a factory could learn to surge. A captain shared sugar so a shipyard could share shifts. When you hear about a bomber rolling off a line every hour, remember a quiet ledger in a hot barracks. When you hear about a convoy leaving on the minute, remember a pecking code on bunk slats. Dapecol was supposed to be a farm that starved Americans. It became a school that fed a country. The next chapter shows what happens when that country moves at full power and refuses to slow down for cruelty. Did you know one American plant pushed a B-24 Liberator off the line about every 63 minutes at its peak? A heavy bomber with a 110-foot wingspan rolling into daylight like a loaf of bread from an oven? That pace was not a miracle. It was a method. Checklists became music. Tool carts became choreography. Across the United States, factories learned the POW lesson, do the next necessary thing on time. The P-51D Mustang got the long legs it needed from 2 drop tanks and turned deep escort into a daily fact. The Browning M2 50 cal roared from bomber turrets in 4-gun and 6-gun, clusters like metal thunder. The M1 Garand, a 10-pound semi-automatic rifle that a GI could field strip in minutes, gave infantry squads a rate of fire that ate ambushes for breakfast. Production was not abstract, it was survival in parts. Numbers tell the story, like drumbeats. Roughly 300,000 American aircraft, thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns, 2,710 Liberty ships, 441 feet long, steel workhorses that left their slips as fast as welders could stitch plates. One yard set a record by launching a Liberty ship in under 5 days from keel to christening. The B-29 Superfortress, pressurized and bristling, stretched a 141-foot wing across the Pacific and carried war to the source. Every figure is a reply to a prison rule. If you starve our men, we will flood the ocean. If you beat them, we will lift the sky. If you mock the law, we will make the law move faster than you can run. Listen to the human echo on the shop floor. A woman in a kerchief checks a torque wrench and says, "Again," until a bolt sings true. A former farmhand wipes cutting oil from his hands and smiles at a fuselage sliding forward 1 station. A foreman with a son in the Philippines taps a clipboard and tells a crew, "On the minute," and the minute answers. This is the same country that hid a square of chocolate for a fever, now building miracles in steel. The enemy tried to win with fear. America answered with abundance. The POW voice threads through the metal. "Be of good cheer," Hardy wrote to his wife, and the arsenal took that as an order. Be of good cheer means hit the tacked time. It means ship the crate. It means keep the promise. When the P-61 Black Widow roared low over a camp to steal eyes from a gate, it was riding on months of parts and hands and nights. When a C-47 touched down on a hacked-out strip with plasma and bandages, it was carrying the small, stubborn kindness of 1,000 line workers who would never see the men they saved. The enemy started to see the pattern they could not match. Their ideology made them waste food, fuel, labor, and chance. They crushed allies instead of partnering. They hid ships instead of marking them. They punished truth and rewarded flattery. That is how you lose a war against a people who treat truth like a tool. Americans measured, tested, corrected, and improved. A prison yard became a laboratory of patience. A nation became a factory of justice. Here is the bridge that takes our breath away. The arsenal of democracy was not only about mass, it was about mercy in motion. Every crate of sulfur and plasma meant a fever broken, a leg saved, a march finished. Every P-51 on station meant a bomber could go deep and still come home. Every Liberty ship in a convoy meant a rescue column could get rice and radios, and a doctor with a quiet voice who knew how to say, "You're safe, now." The next chapter asks a hard question with an easy answer. How do you free more than 500 starving men at once and make it look like the most American thing in the world? You plan. You partner. You go at night. And you win. Did you know that on a January night in 1945, the 6th Ranger Battalion, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas slid across fields and canals, crept to the edge of Cabanatuan, and walked out with more than 500 prisoners of war? The plan was pure American, values plus capability. Leave no man behind, met air and sea mastery, local partnerships, and a clock that never lied. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci led the Rangers. Captain Robert Prince planned the ground assault. Filipino guerrillas, under leaders like Captain Juan Pajota, blocked roads and bridges, keeping Japanese reinforcements away with a mix of courage, deception, and fight. A U.S. P-61 night fighter buzzed low over the camp to freeze eyes and hearts. In the dark near the wire, you could hear men praying in whispers and boots moving like a single body. The first shots were precise and short. A guard fell. A gate swung. Rangers spilled inside with M1 Garands and BARs, working by numbers drilled again and again in daylight miles away. Prisoners blinked, confused, afraid to believe. "Move now," a ranger ordered, and the emaciated ranks tried to stand. Some could not. Carabao carts rolled forward. Filipino civilians guided them toward the river as if this were a night harvest and not a rescue. A medic with a canvas bag knelt in the dust and lifted a chin. "You're going home," he said, and the words worked like medicine. Here is the thing that makes this chapter a heartbeat louder than all the rest. The rescue looked impossible until it looked inevitable. That switch was not luck, it was design. The Alamo Scouts ghosted ahead to map every tree and culvert. The Rangers rehearsed on a mock gate. The guerrillas counted platoons like accountants. When the hour came, everyone did the next right thing. A POW too weak to walk rode a cart. A stronger POW held his buddy upright with a belt. A ranger carried 2 rifles and a man's pride without comment. The P-61 came back around and roared like a storm, so no one would hear the soft sounds that meant, "We are leaving." The enemy's shock was a silence, then a chase, then a lot of nothing. By the time a garrison stirred, the column was gone, a shadow train sliding through sugarcane to safety. Patrols hit empty lanes and moonlit paddies. The men they expected to beat again were already counting steps to the next safe house. This is what happens when you fight a people who train the way they pray and plan the way they love. Fear cannot follow that kind of order at night. Quotes and faces make the numbers human. A rescued prisoner whispered, "I was ready to die yesterday." A guerrilla with mud on his knees grinned and said, "Not today." A ranger, breathless and dusty, told a shaken officer, "Sir, we're Americans. We came back." Those lines fit the weight of the moment because they are the American script playing words at the hardest time. The count by morning was more than 500 saved, a miracle measured and signed. The bridge out of this chapter leads straight into the next crucible. Not every prisoner got a rescue at a gate. Some were trapped in the holds of unmarked freighters, ships crammed with men and heat and thirst. American submarines would hunt the sea as the Rangers hunted the night. Airfields would bloom like islands of light on dark water. The same logic would apply. End the war fast, save who can be saved, and carry the rest home with honor. We will hear about hellships next, and we will hear about choices made in the fog that follows cruelty. But for this night, one truth stands. America promised to return, and then it did, with a plan sharp enough to cut barbed wire and gentle enough to carry the weakest man first. Did you know thousands of prisoners were crammed into the dark holds of unmarked freighters, where heat cooked the air, thirst clawed throats, and a day felt like a month? The names still burn: Orioku Maru, Inura Maru, Brazil Maru. These ships sailed without POW markings, violating the rules that protect captives at sea. American submarines, hunting legal targets, struck what they could not know were human cargoes. It is a sorrow built by enemy decisions and paid for by the weak. In that same season, U.S. submarines strangled the Japanese merchant fleet with a force that made up barely 2% of the Navy, but sank the majority of enemy tonnage. Two truths ran side by side: end the war fast to end the dying, and mourn what the enemy's lawlessness made possible. Inside the holds, men fought for air. They scratched at rust to lick the taste of iron, the only wet on the tongue. A canteen passed hand to hand was a miracle. A prayer whispered into a sleeve was a bridge to morning. Guards dropped rice balls through hatches like bait. Sickness spread in rings. In this hell, American character did not rot. It hardened. A private split, rice ball 3 ways. A corpsman moved along a wall by touch, finding fevers with the back of his hand, saving lives with the last spoon of sulphur. A lieutenant said, "Look at me," to a man sinking, and held him with a stare until the tremor slowed. The human voice did what medicine could not. On the surface of the sea, justice moved fast. Fleet boats hunted tankers and transports, cutting the enemy's lifelines one wake at a time. The sky joined the blockade. B-29 seconds hauled loads over blue days and black nights. Miners dropped strings of obstacles into straits like a fisherman's net made of steel. The purpose was simple and loud. Finish this. Every convoy that turned back meant fewer bullets fired at Marines on beaches and soldiers in valleys. Every ship that went down meant fewer guards to beat men in camps, and fewer officers to order a massacre when the tide turned. The enemy's shock arrived as empty piers and dry tanks. Factories slowed, then stopped. Garrisons rationed until discipline frayed. Commanders felt the map shrink. In that pressure, cruelty got worse. It always does when weak men hold whips. Yet the American answer never changed. A Navy radio man, hearing a fragment of a POW signal, wrote it down like a treasure. An Army pilot, spotting white cloth on a roof, tipped his wing toward headquarters. A submarine skipper, reading intelligence about unmarked ships, made the same sick calculation every statesman makes in war. If we stop, more die. If we press, some die now, so many can live later. Hard choices are still choices. America owned them. Liberation gave shape to the grief. At Bilibid, at Santo Tomas, at camp after camp, the gates opened and emaciated men walked into a light that felt like a miracle. A medic said, slowly, and placed a spoon at a mouth. A chaplain wrote a name. An officer signed an affidavit that would later stand up in court. The ledger kept in hell became a document of truth. The nation that built bombers by the hour now built cases by the page. The bridge into justice is made of names, dates, and a promise to remember. We move next from rescue to reckoning. We will meet the investigators with clipboards and quiet voices. We will watch Americans sort rumor from fact. We will watch them call witnesses, weigh stories, and write judgments with a patience the enemy never showed. War ends with surrender. Peace begins with standards. The United States chose standards, and that choice is the thing that makes victory human. Did you know that within days of liberation, many former prisoners were giving statements under oath, turning memory into evidence with the same discipline they once used to ration sugar and water? A soldier who had just learned to walk again took a pencil in a shaking hand and wrote a guard's name. A chaplain opened a notebook and read the list he had kept in the dark, line by line, so no one would be lost twice. An officer who had learned to say only what mattered in camp now told investigators exactly what happened, when, where, and by whom. The room was quiet. The page was patient. Truth sat down and went to work. The American way of victory showed itself in small decisions. A medic took vitals and then tagged a file with a number that would match an affidavit an hour later. A clerk typed Cabanatuan and O'Donnell so many times the keys shone. An interpreter who had smuggled hope in whispers now translated anger into statements that courts could hear. This is not loud work. It is holy work. The law is not a drumline. It is a heartbeat. It kept time while the country moved from battle to rebuilding. Quotes from the men carry weight like iron. Tell my mother I did my duty. An affidavit recorded from a witness of a roadside shooting. He gave his water to another. Another line said, tying a dead man's last act to a nation's living memory. Be of good cheer, Hardy had written long before, and that thread wound through these rooms again, a steady hand guiding pens and files and faces. The habit of careful words turned into a wall against forgetting. The United States did not punish for rage. It punished for facts. The enemy's shock here was different. They expected chaos to be answered with chaos. They expected hatred to be answered with a mirror. Instead, they found a courtroom. They found exhibits and case numbers. They found calm voices asking, "What exactly did you see?" They found defendants with counsel, witnesses under oath, and a record that would outlive them. This is how a republic fights the last battle of a war. It uses paper the way it used steel. Meanwhile, the human story rolled on. A man who weighed 100 pounds on rescue day put on 30 in a month and learned to sleep again without flinching at every sound. Another walked into a stateside hospital and asked if it was all right to eat twice. A third wrote a note to a widow he had never met because her husband had died in his arms, and the words would not let him rest until they reached her doorstep. He was brave, he wrote. He said your name. Honor returned, one envelope at a time. The bridge into our final truth is as American as it gets. We did not just end the killing, we set a standard for what comes after. The same country that could launch a ship in 5 days and fly a bomber across an ocean also could sit for hours with a witness and get the story right. That patience became power. It built alliances. It rebuilt enemies. It turned the people who once held whips into partners who would one day salute the same goals. The ledger that began as a list of rations and names became a map to a better peace. The last chapter will show how quickly this nation moved from shock to strength to something even better than victory, a future fit for children to inherit. Did you know the United States fought across an ocean, liberated an archipelago, rescued its prisoners, tried war criminals, and then helped rebuild its former enemies into allies between December 1941 and August 1945? Less than 4 years. That is not just speed, that is design. A culture that prized discipline, partnerships, law and production turned suffering into strength and strength into mercy. The arsenal built planes, ships, tanks, radios, and crates of medicine. The services built plans that always asked, who needs help next? The people built a promise that reached from a muddy road in Bataan to a clean hospital bed in San Francisco and to a schoolroom in Tokyo where a child opened a new book in a new era. The facts line up like parade ranks. Hundreds of thousands of aircraft. Thousands of tanks with engines that started in the cold. 2,710 Liberty ships that made the ocean carry American will. Lines that cut steel every hour. Lines that filled glass bottles with penicillin and plasma. Lines that stitched parachutes one panel at a time. A bomber every hour became a synonym for hope. A convoy on schedule became a promise anyone could trust. The habit of counting saved lives. The human faces give those ranks a soul. A prisoner who once weighed 98 pounds learned to stand in a line again, this time at a mess hall with hot coffee and fresh eggs. A nurse showed him how to eat slow. A doctor wrote, "gaining," and underlined it twice. A wife back home opened a telegram and wept for the first time in months because her husband was not only alive, he sounded like himself again. Be of good cheer, he had told her long before the worst. Now he said it at a kitchen table with sunlight on the wood. Quotes still matter. We came back, a ranger told a rescued officer, and that is the American sentence that keeps echoing. Tell my mother I did my duty, a witness had recorded, and that makes the ground of memory firm. I am well, am thin and weak from rice diet, I need money badly, Hardy once wired, and the nation answered with ships, planes, and a rescue plan. These are not speeches. These are instruments. They play a tune called We Keep Our Word. The enemy learned the last lesson in a place they did not expect. Peace. A democracy that used steel like rain, used patience like sunlight. It grew new things. It trained new allies. It proved that mercy is not weakness but strategy. No empire built on cruelty could match it. No system that wasted food and truth could stand against it. The Americans were not simply strong. They were good at being strong. They could outfight and outbuild. More important, they could outlast and outlove. Here is the final holy shit fact. We did all this while writing the rules that would judge us too. Courts' Saturday records were kept. Leaders were questioned. Mistakes were counted as real things. That is what it means to be the most powerful force for freedom. You do not fear the light. You invite it. A nation that can march starving and still share a spoon of sugar is a nation that can cross an ocean and still share a loaf of bread. That is why no other country could have done what America did in that short, fierce span. The story closes where it began, with names: Camp O'Donnell, Cabanatuan, Davao Penal Colony, Bilibid, names that once meant hunger now mean honor. The Republic came back for its people. It brought them out. It wrote down what happened. It remembered the lost with graves that face the Sunday. Then it built a future so broad that even former enemies walk inside it. The last word belongs to every American who kept the line when it mattered most. We are not done. We never will be. The work goes on, and it looks like help reaching the farthest man at the worst moment on time.